If you've followed my channel for a while, you'll know that I'm a very avid deer hunter, and pretty much from the end of August through to the middle of December, I'm out in the bush hunting whitetail. This year, while I was out hunting, I ran into another hunter, and he told me of an encounter he had a couple days before that I found incredibly interesting and creepy. But before we get into today's encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter with anything that you would like to have shared on the show, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And the next time you're out hunting and you have a really weird feeling and it's the end of the day and you're making your way back to the truck, right before you hop in, give that subscribe button a push towards the bush, jump in and take off so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Today's encounter comes from a couple of hunters that I talked to this year during the muzzleloading deer season in the middle of October. These guys want to remain anonymous, so for this story, I'm just going to call them Jack and Tim. Jack and Tim hunt a property located a mile north of my primary property out in Scottsdale, Manitoba. Scottsdale, Manitoba is a very small community located out in Eastern Manitoba. It's pretty much a few miles of gravel road. There's about a dozen houses, dozen residents along this strip. There's no real town or nothing. The closest town would be Elma, which is located about 5-6 miles south. This area is absolutely teeming with wildlife, especially whitetail deer, and this particular property where Jack and Tim were hunting is an absolute deer hunter's paradise. There's 2 food plots on this property. There's beans as well as alfalfa, and it's surrounded on 2 sides by marsh and dense woods. On the western side of the property, there's a creek that runs from the north down towards the south. And on the eastern side of the property, there's a dry creek bed that goes up to a water hole. This property contains absolute giant bucks, and the deer numbers on this small quarter section of property is just absolutely phenomenal. On the day of their encounter, Jack and Tim did not start hunting that property that morning. They hunted a completely different area that morning, and they came to this one for the evening. When they arrived to the property in the afternoon, they pulled their truck into this little ditch kind of off to the side of the bean field, grabbed their gear, and they made their way in towards where they have their one hunting blind and their tent. They made their way about 300 yards across this bean field to where the bean field turns to the right, and then from there was 150 yards to their hunting shack. Their hunting shack is pretty much a shed on a trailer. It's got a couple of windows that open up. It's got a door that opens on the side, and there's a wood stove as well, so if it's really cold, you can stay warm. And they had a tent set up a little bit further down, about 200 yards, right at the edge of the alfalfa field where it turns into the real thick bush. When they got to the shack, Tim decided that he was going to hunt the shack that night, and Jack decided, you know what, instead of hunting in the blind, which is about 200 yards away, kind of in direct line of fire of the shack, he decided he was going to go hunt at that water hole at the base of that old dry creek bed. So the two of them kind of wished each other luck. Jack continued on heading north. He went about 75 yards, turned to his right, and started making his way east towards the water hole. As he was making his way there, he was kind of at high alert, keeping his rifle ready, scanning into the bush, just to see if he could pick up on any deer movement. This particular cut that leads to this water hole is just absolute fire pretty much any time of the day. There's deer moving across this piece like crazy. They'll move across first light, they'll move across pretty much any time of the day. I've seen deer on this particular strip coming across at noon, 1 o'clock, 1:30. It's just, they feel safe in this area. There's real tall grass, thick willows kind of on the sides of the bushes, and it really narrows to a real fine, probably about 3-foot wide gap at one part, about 150 yards away from that alfalfa field. So as Jack was making his way towards that narrowing gap, he's scanning into the trees, trying to catch movement, not really paying attention to anything else aside from trying to pick up on deer. He got to that narrow gap, made his way through, and then he made it 50 yards further to this water hole. He walked up to the right side of the water hole. There's a big rock. He kind of sat down with his back up against the rock, and he was looking towards that narrowing gap. So Jack sat there all afternoon waiting for his target buck. He saw a couple of deer, but at one point he heard something coming real close beside him through the trees. So he kind of turned to his left, looked into the bush, and he saw a big mature doe kind of making her way through the trees towards that creek bed. He got really excited at this point, really hoping that his target buck would be following the doe. Unfortunately for him, that did not end up happening. The buck he was after is a buck in the area that we call freakazoid. This buck is absolutely gorgeous. He's a big 6x5 with a drop tine on his right side. I've seen him a few times. Jack and Tim have seen him a few times. My hunting partner's seen him. Unfortunately, I've just never been able to get him within bow range. He's always just outside. And that was kind of Jack's problem too during the archery season. So once end of legal light came, Jack put on his backpack, grabbed his muzzle loader. He started making his way back towards the alfalfa. When he got to that narrow section, he started to feel a little uneasy, but that's completely normal for him in this area. He's had a lot of run-ins with wolves on this property. I've seen quite a few wolves on this property as well, especially at that time of year. There's a couple of properties off to the east that there's hunters on as well. And what tends to happen is if they take a shot at one and it just wounds it, pretty much the only place where it could go is run to the west, and they'll end up on this property or onto the public land just to the north. So what will happen is that kind of draws a lot of the predators in, a lot of the coyotes and a lot of the wolves. So it's not uncommon to, especially in the evening when you're making your way out, to walk up on or spook up a wolf or a coyote, or even turn around, look behind you and see one standing in the field. So Jack kind of just brushed that off. He's like, you know what? I've done this 100 times before. I have my muzzle loader. My hunting partner's 150 yards away. I'll be fine. So he kept making his way towards the alfalfa. Once he got to the alfalfa, he turned, looked to the left, and he saw Tim's flashlight shining towards him. So he kind of waved at him like, yeah, I see ya. And the two men walked to meet up with each other in the field. They met up, but they started talking, just kind of going over what they saw that night, how many deer they saw in the afternoon. They made their way back across the beams to where that field turned, and then they made the 400-yard walk back to the truck. When they got to the truck, they started popping all their gear into the box, and then Jack decided to go up in front of the truck to look for his deer call. See, while he was sitting there hunting, he did not have his deer call on him. He figured that he must have dropped it when they first got there, and when they first got there, he had actually walked around the front of the truck to look into a neighboring field real quick. So he figured he was just going to go look for this call. So he made his way to the front of the truck, looking down at the ground, and sure enough, about 15 yards in front of the truck, he noticed his deer call lying on the ground. So he walked up to it, bent down to pick it up, and as soon as he went to pick it up, he heard right beside him, almost like it was right in his ear, something say, "Hey." Now, it was not just like a hey, as in like, hey, how's it going? Jack described this hey as being more like, hey. When he heard that, he thought that it was Tim. So he quickly turned to look to his right, and there was nobody there. Tim was not beside him. So Jack was thinking, well, that's weird. Like, I just heard hey, and there's nobody beside me. So he looked towards the truck, figuring, maybe it was definitely Tim, and now he's walking back to the truck. But when he looked towards it, he saw Tim right by the passenger door. So now Jack was really kind of confused, trying to figure out, well, how did Tim get from right beside me to the truck so fast? And how did I not hear him walk up beside me? How did I not hear him walk back to the truck? But Jack kind of tried to brush it off, grabbed his deer call, and made his way back to the truck. When he got to the truck, he said to Tim, like, hey, why did you say hey? And Tim said, what are you talking about? I didn't say anything. He's like, Jack said, well, when I went to grab my deer call, he's like, I heard you say hey right beside me. And Tim looked at him and said, I don't know what you're talking about. I've been by the truck the whole time. He's like, why? What did you hear? So Jack told him exactly how he heard this hey. And as soon as he said that to Tim, Tim freaked out, jumped into the truck and said, let's get the hell out of here. Let's go, go, go. So Jack was pretty shaken up at this point as well, because now his hunting partner, who did not hear this hay, is absolutely freaking out. So he jumped into the truck, started it up, took off up out of that ditch onto the road, and started driving back towards the main highway. As they were driving, they were talking. Tim was pretty shaken up, and same with Jack, but Jack was trying to figure out really like why Tim was, so shooken up when he's not the one that heard this. And Tim said, I just had a really weird feeling this entire night sitting in that shack. I just felt like something was off. I felt like I was being watched. And I've had some really weird feelings on this property before. So as they were driving, they decided, you know what, we're going to turn around. We're going to go see if we could see anybody on the side of the road. Maybe just per chance it was another landowner just kind of messing with us. Now, where Jack had heard this and where their truck is parked, and the nearest house is a half a mile south, and the next nearest house would be just over a half a mile to the east. So for somebody to walk up to this spot just to play a prank on them, they would definitely be noticed as they were driving down the road. When they got back to the property, they drove down into the ditch the way that they had drove out of it, as opposed to driving past and circling and coming down and in the way they normally would. So they drove down into the ditch, made their way along the side of the field, and they came up on the far side of that ditch. As soon as their lights came up and onto the road, they noticed these two white eyes about 4.5 feet off the ground across the road right at the edge of that bush line. They kind of stopped in the truck and they had the headlights shining directly at these eyes, trying to figure out what exactly they were looking at, because they could not see a silhouette or any type of body shape. They just saw these large eyes about 6 inches apart looking right at them at 4.5 feet off the ground. Suddenly these eyes kind of raised up to about 6.5 feet, turned as if almost like a head was turning, and disappeared into the bush. At this point, they were completely freaked out, so they just took off and made their way back down the road to the highway. They got to the highway, they kind of stopped the truck, tried to calm down, kind of rationally discussed what they had saw, and they could really not figure out what it was that they did see. Tim had a theory that what they saw was a skinwalker or some form of a shapeshifter, just based on the fact that Jack heard that hey, and then those eyes were on the other side. Because when Jack had heard hey, the way that they would have came up and out of that ditch to get back onto that road, there's really not a lot of bush there. There's a very thin strip of trees. It's maybe 4 or 5 yards wide, and it runs about 1/8 of a mile up to where there's another bush line right before that big marshy area. So there's really nowhere there for somebody to hide. And if somebody would have kind of booked it into the trees, either Jack or Tim would have heard that. So Tim figured that whatever said hey to Jack would have whipped past them and across the road to the other set of trees on the other side where they had saw those eyes. As I mentioned, I'm very familiar with this property. Me and my hunting partner, we've been hunting out there for about 3 years. It's not our primary location. Our primary property is about 1 mile south, but we do spend a lot of time on that property, especially during archery, through muzzle, towards the end of muzzle loading, and then mid to late rifle. We typically, for about a 3-week period, we tend to avoid that property. We let Jack and Tim hunt it just because we go out a lot more than they do, and we have permission on a bunch of properties in the area. So we kind of let them focus on that property while they're there, because it's the only property in the area that they have permission to hunt on. Now, both myself and my hunting partner, we've never seen anything on this property, but we have both had experiences where the woods just go absolutely silent and you start to feel really on edge. My cousin, who's my hunting partner, on a few occasions now, while he's been walking out, he's felt incredibly uneasy. And if you followed this channel for a while, you'll know that when I first started it, I did a video on some eyes that me and my cousin had seen while hunting. Where that had happened, that was 1 mile south of that property. So those eyes that Jack and Tim saw really remind me of what me and my cousin had seen a couple of years ago out there. So what they had seen, I have no idea. I'm wondering if maybe whatever they experienced is related to what me and my cousin had experienced out there. If you guys have any thoughts on this, please leave it in the comments below. And as always, thanks for joining us. Now, I know I've been away for a little while. It was an incredibly busy fall, followed by a very busy Christmas season. Plus, I got COVID in between there, which was a lot of fun. But I will be back to uploading regularly. So again, thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time.